Hello, my name is Dak Stokes, and welcome to the first episode of the Vampire Historian Podcast. This new podcast will serve as an extension of my blog, found at thevampirehistorian.com, and will start out being published about every 3 weeks. Topics will be drawn from historical vampire stories, religion, folklore, and legend, literature, and occasionally even popular media and culture. Episodes will range between 15 to 30 minutes in length, and will be accompanied by more information on the website, and always by a list of sources and further reading. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the king of all things online vampires, the vampirologist Anthony Hogg, for his continued support and help getting things started, and for coming up with great names for blogs. The Vampire Historian site is the progression from our first blog, Killing the Dead. I would also like to go ahead and acknowledge Professor Elizabeth Miller, whose works form the basis of much of this episode. Before I get started with today's topic, I feel I should talk a little bit about myself. First off, I live in Texas, where I serve as an academic reference librarian and a music professor at a community college. About 5 years ago, I was trying to come up with a topic for a public lecture for one of our honors programs, and since the date that I was given was in October, I thought, how about vampires? The Twilight movies were big at that time, and I had recently received a few vampire books as gifts from family members that knew that I'd always been a little obsessed with the topic since The Lost Boys was released in 1987. So I prepared what is now my basic vampire lecture, which is called From Vlad the Impaler to Edward Cullen, Origins of the 21st Century Vampire Myth, Literature, Television, and Film. And that's a lecture that I've presented about 6 times now since 2010. Since then, I've amassed a much larger library of vampire books, made several connections in the field, and presented several other lectures on various vampire-related topics. And those include Eastern European burial practices, Victorian vampire literature, Frankenstein and Dracula in their historical context, Dracula in film, Stoker's influences when writing Dracula, and most recently a lecture titled The Real Dracula, Separating Vlad the Impaler from the Fictional Count. I've also wrote an article on the many actors that have played Dracula for the vampire edition of Indie Judge, which was published in October 2013. But it's the last lecture topic, though, that we'll be discussing today. When I was first preparing the last lecture on Vlad the Impaler this fall, I went to iTunes to listen to any podcasts that I could find about Vlad the III, or Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula. And I proceeded to listen to them all, almost all of them by non-vampire scholars. I found that they all had one thing in common, and that's the belief that Stoker's Count Dracula was based on the real-life Vlad Tepes. Now, I'll admit that when I first started out as a, quote, vampire scholar, or vampirologist, I thought the same thing. Once you spend any time looking into modern research on the topic, it becomes fairly clear that this just isn't the case. So, how did this idea become so ingrained in our culture? Well, there are several influences at work that we're going to talk about. The most obvious link is the name. There was a historical person that went by the name Dracula. His real name is Vladislav III, the Prince of Wallachia, who lived from 1435 to 1476. A national hero to Romanians, a bloodthirsty tyrant to many modern-day thinkers. Vlad was described in a 16th century Russian pamphlet as a cruel but just ruler. His nickname Tepes, which means the Impaler, was very well deserved, as we know that impalement was his preferred method of execution, though not the only one that he used. But it has also been speculated that he was responsible for anywhere between 40,000 and 100,000 deaths during his short reign. There are many other stories about his cruelty, which you can learn about from many of the other podcasts I listen to, and even more legends about his sadistic practices, including one story about how he liked to dip his bread in the blood of his victims before eating it, thus tying him in with vampires. So of course it's obvious that this must be the man that Stoker based his immortal character on. Well, not entirely. It is true that in the novel Dracula, both the Count and Van Helsing discuss briefly the history of the Dracula family and their warring with the Turks, but that's about it. Never does anyone mention the impaling or the legends or stories. Van Helsing does eventually call Dracula the Evil One and mentions witchcraft in the word vampire or vampire. But where does this connection come from? When discussing what I call the connection between Vlad and Dracula, Count Dracula, Two names are important to remember, and that's Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu. In the 1960s and 70s, they were history professors at Boston College, and together they published a very important book called In Search of Dracula. Now, they were not the very first or last to connect Vlad the Impaler with Count Dracula, but their 1972 book and later works became widely known and made the case for the connection. Since then, it's become the common idea, especially in films such as Dan Curtis's Dracula with Jack Palance in the 70s, a documentary from the 70s, In Search of Dracula, based on the book, starring Christopher Lee, or Francis Ford Coppola's 1991 so-called Bram Stoker's Dracula, and of course 2014's Dracula Untold. So what's the problem with this connection? Well, when McNally and Florescu and other authors before them wrote about Stoker's influences, it was mostly based on speculation, and that's because Stoker's notes had been auctioned off after his death in 1913, or they were auctioned in 1913. And by the 1940s, their whereabouts were basically unknown. Then in 1970, the notes appeared at the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. And it's here that McNally and Florescu happened upon Stoker's very extensive notes. And they are very extensive. Stoker kept very good notes on the development of the story, and many notes about his sources as well. So many notes that any connection between Vlad and the Count, if Stoker meant for it to exist, would be there somewhere. So here's what we know from Stoker's notes. And as I mentioned in the acknowledgments earlier, a lot of the work on the notes is going to be based heavily on the work of Elizabeth Miller. So number one, we know from the notes that Count Dracula was originally called Count Vampire. And the first work on the story began actually about 2 years before Stoker would have ever seen the name Dracula in print. Number two, we know that Stoker found several sources that he used for the book, but only one of them mentions anything at all about Vlad III or the name Dracula. That book is William Wilkinson's 1820 work, An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, with various political observations relating to them. In that book, there are 2 paragraphs about the voivode Dracula who fought the Turks. The information is basically the same as what appears in the novel. No mention of the name Vlad or impaling of any kind. But there is one very important footnote, and Stoker types this footnote out in his notes, and it reads thus: Dracula in Wallachian language means devil. Wallachians were accustomed to give it as a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous by courage, cruel actions, or cunning. And that's all we have. The only mention of Dracula in any of Stoker's known sources. Stoker had many other sources about Transylvanian superstitions, but they don't mention Dracula. Now there is another claim, though, to prove that Stoker knew about Vlad, and that is that he met at least twice, we know, with a Hungarian professor named Arminius Van Berry, and that Van Berry must have told him all about Vlad the Impaler. But as Elizabeth Miller points out, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that this is true, since there's no record of their correspondence and no record of what happened at their meetings, and nothing else about Vlad appears in the novel or in Stoker's notes. Of course, Van Berry is obviously the basis for Van Helsing's friend, Arminius, the professor from Budapest, who does give Van Helsing information about Dracula. But again, there's no proof that this happened in real life between Van Berry or Stoker. And if it did, why did it not make it into the novel, or at least into the notes? So what can we be certain of? And that would be that Stoker liked the name Dracula, and especially the fact that it means devil. And then also that the only historical information in the novel to tie the Count to Vlad was found from Wilkinson's book. We also know that McNally and Florescu had not seen the notes when they first published their book in 1972, but that they had seen them by the time they published other works, and of course by the 1994 revision of the original book, yet their premises mostly remained the same. Another contentious fact in the separation of Vlad and the Count can be found in Van Helsing's statement that Dracula was called a vampire or a vampire. This has been discussed in the book The Darkling, a treatise on Slavic Vampirism by the scholar J.L. Perkowski, who points out that the term did not even appear in writing, the term vampire, that is, until the 18th century. So any mention of it by any contemporaries of Dracula would not have really made much sense. Perkowski also makes an intriguing comparison in this book of the story of Dracula to that of St. Nicholas, which I think might be discussed in a future episode of its own. For now, we're left with a few facts still. That's that Stoker kept detailed notes, and the only information in those notes about Dracula and the historical figure appear in the novel. And it's difficult to fault scholars that wrote before 1970, as they did not have access to the notes. But for the claim to still be going strong today, that Count Dracula is largely based on Vlad III, almost 45 years after the notes were found, is almost inexcusable. There is also one newer claim, and that is that knowledge of the Dracula bloodline was very common in 19th century England due to the fact that the royal family is distantly related to one of Vlad III's brothers. And this is being dealt with in a soon-to-be-released book, so for now we'll just leave it at that. From information that's already available, though, it seems that this is another speculation. By the way, you can purchase a nice facsimile edition of Stoker's notes, including annotations and transcriptions, published by McFarland in 2008. And I would also like to lead you to two other works by Elizabeth Miller, who worked on the facsimile of the notes as well. Her book, Dracula, Sense and Nonsense, which tackles quite a bit of this information and many other things about Dracula. And then also Bram Stoker's Dracula, a documentary journey into vampire country and the Dracula phenomenon, which is a great anthology about everything having to do with the book. Information on these books and other books that were consulted for this episode can be found at thevampirehistorian.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at VampHistorian, or find the Vampire Historian on Facebook or Instagram. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to thevampirehistorian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check back in about 3 weeks for another episode.